If it's Wednesday, President Trump's latest economic U-turn as he reassures the markets that tariffs on China will come down and that the Federal Reserve Chair's job is safe as the administration signals a softening of its rhetoric after warnings of market turmoil. Plus, a federal judge issues a new scathing rebuke of the Trump administration, accusing the federal government of willfully refusing to comply with the court in the deportation case of Kilmar Obrego Garcia. And top White House officials pull out of a high-level round of Ukraine peace talks as President Trump lashes out at President Zelensky for rejecting the idea that Russia could maintain control of Crimea. Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where we begin with breaking news as stocks rose for a second straight day, with President Trump walking back his threat to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and the White House signaling de-escalation in its trade war with China. Stocks finished the day higher for the second day in a row. The Dow rose more than 400 points at one point. It was over 1,000 points. Over the last two trading sessions, the major indices are up roughly 3 to 5%. Now, the improvement in market vibes comes after President Trump publicly echoed private assurances made by his Treasury Secretary to Wall Street bankers that sky-high tariffs with China will have to come down. Here's the president yesterday afternoon and this morning signaling changes to the current 145% tariff on Chinese imports.
I'm not going to say, oh, I'm going to play hardball with China. I'm going to play hardball with you, President Xi. No. We're going to be very nice. They're going to be very nice. And we'll see what happens. But ultimately, they have to make a deal. 145% is very high, and it won't be that high. It's not going to be that high. It'll come down substantially, but it won't be zero. It used to be zero. We were just destroyed. China was taking us for a ride, and just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We're going to be very good to China. Every country wants to partake, even countries that have ripped us off for many, many years. China is an example. We're going to make a lot of money for our people. We'll be able to lower taxes substantially, and we're going to be proud of ourselves.
Now, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told reporters today that neither China nor the U.S. believe that these tariffs are at sustainable levels. He's calling it the equivalent of a trade embargo that really doesn't suit anyone's interest. It comes amid escalating pressure, though, on the White House. Axios reports that American retail titans personally warned the president this week that his trade policies could soon disrupt supply chains, leading to higher prices and empty shelves. And we've also seen a constant drumbeat of warnings from investors worried about the president's impulses and his threats to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, who Trump himself appointed to the job. Less than a week ago, the president publicly said, quote, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. On Monday, he called Powell a, quote, major loser, comments which roiled the market. But yesterday, the president essentially rescinded those threats.
I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates. This is a perfect time to lower interest rates. If he doesn't, is it the end? No, it's not. But it would be good timing. It could have taken place earlier. But no, I have no intention to fire him.
Now, the Wall Street Journal reports that the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary were instrumental in getting Trump to drop his threats against Powell, warning him that trying to oust the head of the independent central bank would trigger legal challenges and chaos in the markets. Of course, all of the headlines right now about the president's softening on the Fed and China are just that. They're just headlines right now. And in this political environment, we never know what could happen next. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung, and Jason Furman. He was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama White House. He's now a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So, Gabe, let's start with you. The Trump we've heard in the last 24 hours seems to be a lot different than the Trump we heard earlier this month. What went into this change in posture? Was he spooked by the markets and the economic developments?
Hey there, Ryan. Well, certainly a softening of tone from the president, as you just laid out. Look, there was a confluence of factors here that really have been building over the last several days. You talked about the markets. Look, it was just a couple of days ago that we were getting that headline that the markets were heading towards their worst April since the Great Depression. Now, add that to the fact that there were several CEOs from major retailers here on Monday, from Walmart, Target, Home Depot. Lowe's was supposed to come here, but we understand that they didn't. Either way, they had a conversation with the president here at the White House about trade, about tariffs, and that all led up to yesterday when in that Oval Office meeting with reporters, the president dramatically shifted his tone, not just about tariffs on China, but also about potentially firing Jerome Powell, who was just played. He said that he wouldn't do it. So it was several things leading up to this. Certainly a lot of people in his ear, including potentially the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, may have led to that softening of the tone there.
And there does appear to be a bit of confusion, Gabe, about the talks with China right now. I mean, what is the latest there with Chinese tariffs? Are the two sides actually engaging at all? Trump says the talks are active. Do we even know what level these talks are taking place at?
Well, that appears to be a moving target, Ryan. The president earlier today did say that active talks were underway, but around that same time this morning, the Treasury Secretary was speaking with reporters, and he said that the talks hadn't actually started yet. And then a senior administration official telling NBC News that the talks were indeed underway, but that they were happening at a lower level, than a sub-cabinet level. So we still don't know exactly what is happening here with regards to those talks. But I want to play a little bit of what the president told reporters earlier today here at the White House. Listen.
Can you clarify, Mr. President, on China?
Yeah,
are you thinking about lowering their tariffs?
Fair deal with China. It's going to be fair.
Are you talking to them actively now?
Actively. Everything's active. Everybody wants to be a part of what we're doing.
So again, the president there saying that active negotiations were underway. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt this afternoon saying that they were in discussions with many countries right now. But as it stands now, Ryan, we don't have any clarity on exactly what level these talks with China are supposedly happening.
And another issue we're looking to get clarity on is the future of Elon Musk. He says he's scaling back his time with Doge. What could that mean?
Well, several things there. So, yes, yesterday during an earnings call, Elon Musk, after profits were down 71% of Tesla, he did say that he would scale back his time here at the White House with Doge, saying that his work with Doge had largely taken place, that he had established this Department of Government Efficiency, and they would probably only work here in the government 1 or 2 days a week if the president would have him. But the fact is, Ryan, that Elon Musk has been facing increasing pressure from the financial world to pay more attention to Tesla, given the fact that his political work has led to that steep drop in stock price, also vandalism against Tesla dealerships as well. And the Trump White House had been saying that he was going to work here until his end of his time as a special government employee, which we believe to be in late May. But he has lost some influence, at least in the last couple of weeks, because remember, it was his pick for acting IRS commissioner that was appointed. Then it was that the commissioner was dismissed just a few days later at the urging of the Treasury Secretary, Ryan.
Okay, Gabe, thank you for starting us off from the North Lawn. Let's go now to Brian Chung. Another roller coaster day, Brian. Break down what we saw on Wall Street. Does it appear that the markets like what they heard from the White House this week?
Yeah, well, it appears that they did, because the markets had a pretty nice close, in the green. They did start the morning looking like they would be even higher in terms of those gains. Now it seems like maybe investors are a little bit sobering up to the idea that maybe those conversations and the temperature of those conversations with China aren't as substantive as we thought, given that based off of what Gabe was just talking about, we don't know if those conversations are really, in progress right now. But nonetheless, this does underscore that the volatility is still present there in the markets. I mean, I think if you talk about the Overton window shifting, it seems like we are now at the stage of this trade conversation where it seems like markets are going to be very much at the whim of what those negotiations or communications between the United States and China look like. This is very similar, I want to point out, to the 2018-2019 trade war that the Trump administration in its first iteration went about with China, where there were a lot of attention was paid to Robert Lighthizer, the then U.S. trade representative, and whether or not he was having discussions concerns with China. You saw market swings very similarly like we're seeing now. That might be the story in the months to come, just the nature and whether or not those discussions are happening, Ryan.
And I wonder if investors' habits are changing as a result of this kind of unprecedented way that Donald Trump is kind of attacking the economy. I want to put up a line from Bloomberg's Matt Levine. He said that previous Treasury secretaries would have met with investors and said things like, well, the world's two largest economies will have to find a way to work together. And investors would have said, sure, of course. And it wouldn't have been particularly market moving. But now when the Treasury secretary tells you that, your reaction is, oh, wow, that's a drastic policy shift from yesterday. And then you rush to buy stocks. Does it seem as though investors are reacting to every little thing that's happening that comes out of this administration? Because they can't possibly be confident that this is the end of the de-escalation, right? Is it about short-term games right now? How's the market overall reacting to this?
Yeah, I mean, Matt Levine, great read. I do want to point out that, when it comes to that kind of perspective, that's probably not a good thing for markets, because as an investor, you want certainty in the types of investments that you're making. Generally, when you buy a stock, you are hoping that you're going to get capital accumulation, or that stock price will go up based off of future cash flows. But you don't know what the future cash flows are going to be if you don't even know what the tariff rate is going to be come tomorrow or come an hour from now. So I think it speaks to the uncertainty that's underlying markets. But I think the bigger question is really, it's not about the S&P 500 or the Dow that is concerning a lot of economists and financial types. It's really what's happening in bond markets, which did apparently convince the president to scale back those tariffs on all those countries around the world.
Yeah. OK. Brian Chung, thank you for that. Let's go now to Jason Furman to get his take on all of this. First, Jason, I want to start with your reaction to what you've seen out of the Trump administration in the last 24 hours. To you, does this look like they're caving, or is it really just a short-term effort to juice the market?
Look, they have done a lot of damage through their policies on trade and their rhetoric on the Fed. And it's good that they've undone a fraction of that damage, but it's only a fraction of that damage. Moreover, I am worried. The China talks are going to be harder than they think. Maybe we're going to settle for a token concession, call it off. That would be fine. But if we want something big and meaningful, we haven't set it up in the right way to achieve that.
What do you think it was that led to Donald Trump walking this back a little bit? Is it the bond market that he's worried about? Is he worried about empty store shelves, the alarming message he got from these big box retailers? What do you think was kind of the final straw for him?
Yeah, I don't know what the final straw was. 2 weeks ago, it was the bond market. Maybe this time it was the retailers. 1 week it's Jamie Dimon. Next week it's something else. It's good to know that he is reactive and responsive to these pressures. But that's a reminder that everything coming out of these policies is pretty much bad, especially the yelling at the Fed. Nothing good comes out of that for anyone. And so there's just... everyone has a motive to try to talk him out of it, and sometimes he listens, sometimes he doesn't.
It's interesting you bring up Powell. Do you think that the assurances he's given around Powell's job is enough, or is there always the concern that he could turn back on it again and be angry with Powell again and call for his removal?
Look, I think the words he used was for now, so I'm not sure, but, Powell's term ends in May of next year. I'd love to see him reappointed. Sadly, that's not going to happen. And it is obviously a legitimate choice for the president to choose and nominate someone else and see them through the Senate. So I hope his people can convince him, just wait a year and you can solve this so-called problem.
And finally, and you've kind of already alluded to this, but given all the uncertainty and Trump's mercurial nature, what if he does end up getting some sort of concessions from his trading partners? Will those disruptions be worth it? Is there a big enough win to go through all the pain that we've seen in the economy over the past couple of months?
No. Most of these countries have pretty minimal barriers to American exports. So Vietnam could lower its tariffs all the way to zero, and it would help our economy by 0.0001% or something like that. So causing known certain damage for concessions that would help our exports a tiny bit to a few countries around the world, there would have been a much easier way to get to that outcome. It's just not worth this pain.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of uncertainty still ahead as we continue to go through this. Jason Furman, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Coming up, NBC News' exclusive reporting on how two Venezuelans living in the U.S. seemingly with protected status ended up in El Salvador's notorious mega prison. We're live in San Salvador with that story. Plus, my interview with a House Democrat fresh off a congressional trip to El Salvador as he pushes for due process and the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The Maryland judge in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's mistaken deportation to El Salvador is once again rebuking the Trump administration for trying to obstruct a court-ordered discovery process and is accusing the government's lawyers of acting in bad faith. The judge said the government provided, quote, vague, evasive, and incomplete answers to questions about Abrego Garcia's deportations, setting a 6 p.m. deadline today for the administration to provide additional specific and factual answers to supplement its response. Joining me now in studio is NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. And NBC's David Noriega is still in El Salvador for us. Julia, let's start with you. The judge in the Abrego Garcia case, once again expressing her frustration with the government's lawyers. What more did she say, and what happens next?
Yeah, we're seeing judges across the country really throw the book, to put a fine point on it, at the Trump administration for not providing more information. Obviously, this is the most high profile, but I've been reading transcripts from federal judges across the country saying that they don't think the Justice Department's providing enough information on these people. And in this case, she could be looking at a contempt order if they don't provide more information. She needs to show, or they need to show her rather, that they're doing a good faith effort to facilitate his return. That includes depositions with Trump officials who have firsthand knowledge of any efforts to bring him back, because unless they can show they're trying, it's hard for them to check the box and say, yes, we are doing everything we can to facilitate his return. Remember, the Supreme Court said they didn't have to go as far as to effectuate, but they haven't even come close to the definition of facilitate yet in her mind. And so they need to provide those documents. The other thing she wants them to provide is some kind of contract between the U.S. and El Salvador, so she can say, all right, if you say your hands are tied, let's see why. Why is it that these two countries that seemingly have such wonderful diplomatic relations, we see the leaders together all the time, you can't facilitate his return? And so clock is ticking, and meanwhile, the Trump administration is actually asking for a 7-day stay on this order for discovery.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I mean, does this seem like a delay tactic? And also, doesn't it contradict their claims that they need to move fast to get these people out of the country?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, it seems that they move fast to get them out, but then when it comes to bringing them back, the clock moves in the other direction. And so we've seen this at the D.C. level when they were arguing about why they couldn't turn those planes around initially, that discovery really hit a stop there. They weren't able to hand over a lot of that information. And in a lot of cases, I saw one just recently where in Eastern District of Virginia, they weren't able to hand over information to tie someone to the Tren de Aragua gang. These are some pretty basic evidence that usually a prosecutor would come to court with, that they're just not bringing in these cases. And so it's unclear if that's a strategy to just delay, or if they do think they may head toward contempt and they're willing to have that fight with the judicial system.
Yeah. So you also have some new reporting about how the administration plans to expand their immigration detention capacity, but they're running into some roadblocks. What's happening there?
Yeah, it's strange. They terminated a $3.8 billion contract to build a mass tent city in Fort Bliss. And Ryan, if you can remember, this was the plan B to Guantanamo. Remember, Trump said we're going to put 30,000 immigrants in Guantanamo Bay. He said that early on. It was really kind of the first big scary tactic they had. That fell apart because they weren't able to really get the conditions going. They weren't able to get logistics and do it in a cost-effective way. You have to meet certain conditions, federally mandated conditions on ICE detention for safety and health reasons. They weren't able to meet there. And it looks like in this case, they're tearing up this contract once again. Perhaps it could be because it is so hard to build soft-sided facilities, that, basically tents for so many people. They've got to provide air conditioning, running water. If someone is a threat, they have to be able to secure the safety of the people watching over them. It's logistically really complicated, and typically it's about 2 to 3 times more expensive to house an immigrant for a night in a tent rather than in a brick-and-mortar facility. So all of that to say, I know that's kind of in the weeds, but this is Plan B now falling through. And I'm still scratching my head, frankly, to figure out why the Trump administration isn't using more legally available pathways to make good on this promise for mass deportations. Why not hire more immigration judges, use more of the space you already have? I don't really know the answer to that.
Right. Okay. And they're not really providing the answers to those questions. All right, Julia Ainsley, thank you for your reporting as always. Let's go to David Noriega now, who is in El Salvador. David, you have some exclusive reporting about 2 more individuals who were deported from the U.S. and are now being held at CICA. What do we know about their situations?
Ryan, we've been hearing from Trump administration officials for weeks now that everybody who was deported to the Secot mega prison here in El Salvador was a known member of either Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang, or MS-13, the Salvadoran gang, that they posed a threat to public safety in the United States. But we have new information about 2 additional cases, in addition to all the others that we've heard about, where the families and lawyers of these men are denying that that is the case. I'll start with the case of Isqueiber Peñalosa. He's 26 years old. He was living for a few months in North Carolina. Before that, he lived for a few years in Chile, and then before that, of course, in Venezuela. We looked for a criminal record in all of those countries, found none, although we did find a traffic violation in North Carolina. His family says that he got swept up in this because of his tattoos. But his tattoos, Ryan, are of things like olive branches symbolizing peace, or a portrait of his ex-girlfriend. His lawyers in the United States insist that he is not a gang member and are trying to get some kind of relief for him. We also heard from a Salvadoran human rights attorney here in San Salvador about the case of Rolando Barreto. He is 34 years old. He was living with his wife, also Venezuelan, in Utah. They were both picked up by ICE. His wife was actually on that plane to Secot, to El Salvador, but was one of the women that was turned back to the United States because the Bukele administration was not willing to accept women into this prison. And notably, Ryan, we obtained paperwork showing that both of them had temporary protected status at the time of their deportation. Temporary protected status is a legal form of status in the United States. It's supposed to protect them from deportation. The U.S. government, of course, can revoke it, but there usually has to be a reason for that, and we haven't found any indication that there was a criminal record for either of them either. Now, their lawyer here in El Salvador is going to file a habeas corpus petition, but in this country, that is more or less a symbolic move because this prison system is really designed to offer inmates very little recourse. Ryan?
And speaking of that, you've been on the ground there in El Salvador. What have you learned about the conditions inside their prison system?
Well, let's start with Secot, right? The mega prison that we've all been hearing about, that we've all seen the footage of. The human rights defenders, advocates, lawyers, et cetera, that I've been talking to here, one of the things that they've been consistently telling me is that prison, in spite of the overcrowded cells, the metal bunks with no mattresses, the 24/7 bright lights on, that is actually one of the more humane prisons in El Salvador. The other prisons are notoriously difficult. There are systematic abuse. There are allegations of systematic abuses like torture, starvation. We visited a prison, an infamous prison here in San Salvador yesterday. We didn't go inside. We weren't allowed to go inside, but we spent some time outside and met with some families who were buying basic goods for their loved ones inside because they don't get provided those goods. Even everything from toilet paper to clean clothes, like the prison uniforms, need to be bought by the loved ones outside. So this is really a prison system that human rights defenders here have been trying to call attention to for some time, Ryan.
All right. David Noriega, thank you for that reporting on the ground. We appreciate it. And as we learn more about El Salvador's prison system, more Democrats are traveling there to call for the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, making that case that fixing his mistaken removal to El Salvador is a matter of due process. Yesterday, I spoke with Congressman Robert Garcia, who was among the Democratic lawmakers who traveled to El Salvador. I began by asking him about what he felt like he accomplished with this trip.
Look, I think what's really first important is that we know right now that we have a Supreme Court that's voted 9-0 to ensure that Kilmar is sent back to the United States. The Trump administration has been clear that they have no intention of doing that. They've also knowingly admitted that they sent him there on accident, and now that is being defied, which is incredibly serious for due process in this country. Well, we took a group of House Democrats. We asked for an official codel from House Republicans. On the House side, you have to get permission from the majority. They refused to do so, to grant a congressional delegation. And so we just had to go ourselves. It's important for us to continue to go. What Senator Van Hollen did was absolutely the right thing. We won't also be the last group. There'll be more House Democrats that will go. We met with the U.S. Embassy there and the ambassador on the ground, had a classified briefing, got a lot of important information. We made continued demands for Kilmar's release. We also asked about other folks that are there wrongly in prison, like Andrea Romero, who's an LGBTQ asylum seeker, and others. We also met with Kilmar's and talked with Kilmar's family and a lot of organizers and advocates that are also in El Salvador working on Kilmar's release. And so a lot of good progress, but the work isn't done until Kilmar is Kilmar back home and Donald Trump follows the Supreme Court.
You mentioned your meeting with the ambassador. I know much of what you talked about was classified, but did you get any sense that the administration, the Trump administration, I mean, is making any effort to secure Abrego Garcia's release?
No, and in fact, it was pretty clear. What I can say, it was pretty clear that the U.S. Embassy has no indication and has received no direction to begin facilitating that return. And so that's incredibly concerning when the Supreme Court has been clear that the facilitation of the return needs to happen. And the embassy has not received that indication. And we got that information directly from them on the ground. Yeah. What we were able to secure is there's a second case of Andrea Romero, who's the asylum seeker, LGBTQ, who's wrongly been sent to this prison, having an appointment that we gave him through our asylum process. The embassy did, for the first time, acknowledge this individual and actually request that we get a health and wellness check on him. And so that's the first time that's happened. We hope to hear about that in the next day or two.
Now, throughout the trip, we saw you and your colleagues going to social media. You did a lot of TV interviews, and your critics are saying this was just about political posturing. How would you respond to that?
Oh, look, there's the number one issue that folks in my office back home are calling me about is this one. And in the last 2 weeks, we have heard more about this case, the attack on democracy, the defiance of the Supreme Court, than any other issue that's come into our office. It's incredibly important to the people back home and people across the country. It's important that we have to build support in El Salvador. Right now, we met with human rights activists, with advocates, with people in the faith community that are building support to release Kilmar and others who have been wrongly imprisoned illegally in El Salvador. And remember, they understand that this is bigger than just immigration. This is a due process issue in the United States. In the United States of America, everyone has a right to due process, whether you are a citizen or you are a non-citizen, whether you are in a student visa, you still have that right. And that is being stripped away from people right now because of the Trump administration.
I want to put up what Speaker Johnson had to say about your trip. He said, quote, "Today, House Democrats traveled to El Salvador as part of their obsession to bring a violent illegal alien and member of MS-13 back into the United States. Could the contrast be more clear?" he wrote. "House Republicans remain committed to doing everything we can to protect American families and keep dangerous gang members out of our country. We should point out there is no direct evidence that Abrego Garcia was a member of MS-13. But Republicans have been working very hard to try and show, or at least create an optic, that you're working on behalf of a suspected gang member. Are you at all concerned about the political optics here?"
I think I'm not, because it's important that at the end of the day, we're working in the truth and on facts. Mike Johnson basically now is just a mouthpiece for Donald Trump. And if he wants to repeat Donald Trump's lies, he can continue to do so. But the truth is that there's no evidence that he was in that gang. He was sent there wrongly. The Trump administration has already admitted to that. And so we can't hide away because we think something is bad politics or because we can't be debating multiple things at once. We should be able to forcefully demand that Kilmar is returned, that people get due process in this country, that they're not sent in an asylum process to foreign prisons in El Salvador, and at the same time advocate for Social Security, for no cuts to Medicare, so that Elon Musk isn't raiding the federal treasury. So we should be able to talk about all of these things. And Mike Johnson, unfortunately, now has no issue with essentially lying like Donald Trump does, and it's really sad to see.
Now, the public didn't buy the Democrats' arguments on democracy in the 2024 election. That was a big push that your party used in the 2024 election. Donald Trump still won, and during that election, he pledged to deport undocumented immigrants. Do you think that this is a political winner for you, and how do you make it a political winner?
Well, there's also been recent polling just a few days ago that over 60% of Americans don't believe that we should be sending undocumented people to foreign prisons. And so I think we've got to be able to explain this issue to the American public in the most simplest terms, which is this is Donald Trump defying Supreme Court Order 9-0. This is not just an immigration debate. This is a debate, broader debate about due process. Everyone in our country deserves a right to a lawyer, to a fair trial in court. And our laws are clear whether you're a citizen, whether you're an immigrant, whether you're here on a student visa, whether you're protesting something that you believe in. If you are arrested, you have a right to a judicial process that is fair. That is now being denied to people in this country, and I think all Americans should be concerned about that.
Okay, Congressman Garcia, just back from El Salvador. Congressman, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And up next, are Ukraine peace talks on the brink of collapse? We have an update on where negotiations stand as President Trump lashes out at President Zelensky, accusing the Ukrainian leader of harming efforts to end the war. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. In the latest escalation between the Trump administration and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the president posting a lengthy message to Truth Social accusing Zelensky of derailing peace negotiations when Zelensky rejected the idea that Russia be allowed to retain control of Crimea. President Trump saying that Zelensky's inflammatory statements are making it difficult to end the war. It comes after Vice President J.D. Vance called on both sides to accept the U.S. peace proposal.
It's now time, I think, to take, if not the final step, one of the final steps, which is at a broad level, the parties saying we're going to stop the killing, we're going to freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today. We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, meanwhile, withdrew late last night from high-level peace talks in London, canceling plans to meet with his British, French, and Ukrainian counterparts. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff also pulled out of today's meetings in London. The White House said yesterday that Witkoff will be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Russia later this week. Overnight, Russia fired 134 attack drones into Ukraine, killing at least 9 people, according to Ukrainian officials. And joining me now is NBC's chief foreign affairs correspondent and chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. So, Andrea, I know there's a lot to break down here about these high-level peace talks that were scheduled for today that broke down, but we did just hear from President Zelensky.
Indeed. President Zelensky is trying to smooth this over, praising the lower-level technical talks that were held with the Ukrainian foreign minister and representatives from the U.S., Keith Kellogg from the U.S., and others from Germany, Britain, and France. But this is not the foreign minister talk, so it was definitely downgraded. So he says emotions have run high today. It's good that 5 countries did meet. And he's saying, I'm sure that, we share the same visions. Ukraine and other Europeans presented their inputs. We hope that it's exactly such joint work that will lead to lasting peace. We're grateful to partners. Ukraine will always act in accordance with its constitution. And he has said separately today, telling the Wall Street Journal, the Ukrainian constitution does not let him give up Crimea to Russia. Right. The U.S. proposal is to give up Crimea to Russia, which was occupied in 2014 by Russia. Yeah. And in his blast that you referred to on social media, the president criticizes Zelensky and Ukraine for not fighting to get Crimea back before this all happened. Right. Zelensky wasn't the president of Ukraine in 2014. Right. They had a democratic election afterwards and after that whole uprising. So,
but even though Zelensky might be encouraged by these low-level talks, these big issues are still so unresolved. And, and that's what's leading Secretary Rubio to talk about, questioning how long the U.S. may want to stay in this. Listen to what he said on a podcast earlier.
If at some point we determine that we're just too far apart and not enough movement is happening, we may need to move on to other priorities because there are a lot of important things happening in the world. This is not our war. We didn't start this war.
Rubio keeps saying this, right? He keeps suggesting the U.S. might just walk away, right?
He said it to us when we were in NATO in Brussels 2 weeks ago, going on 3 weeks now, rather. And he said it last week. He's saying this today. But it's Russia that hasn't accepted the 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine accepted the 30-day ceasefire. Russia accepted an Easter ceasefire, and there was fighting even on Easter Day. And again, as you pointed out, that there was a missile attack that the Ukrainian officials said last night killed 9 people. So it is lopsided. The proposal from the U.S. that Vance detailed today, so now it's on the record, has Crimea going to Russia and NATO not ever being an option for Zelensky. That's not a deal. It also has Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear plant in all of Europe, going to Russia. They now control it. They've occupied it. And Zelensky says that that's not acceptable.
But if Rubio is right, that there is a point that the U.S. walks away, what does that mean for Ukraine in their hopes of winning the war?
The plan, I think, would be if these talks collapse, I think what you're going to see, that the U.S. is going to stop military aid and stop intel again. I mean, that's the implicit threat. By the way, I just misspoke. It wouldn't be the U.S. would take control of Zaporizhia. That would not be part of Russia control. But it is definitely a lopsided plan, and it's take it or leave it to Zelensky. And Witkoff is going to Moscow, according to at least the Russians and now the White House as well.
Yeah, it seems pretty far away from Donald Trump promising he was going to end this war on day one to where we are now. All right, Andrea Mitchell, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Turning down to the Vatican, and you're about to look at live pictures of St. Peter's Basilica, where thousands of mourners have been filing throughout the day, some waiting in line up to 6 hours to catch a glimpse and possibly say a prayer for Pope Francis. This morning, accompanied by cardinals from all over the world, the Pope's coffin was carried through St. Peter's Square, weaving past 20,000 worshipers who gathered to pay their respects. The crowd erupted into applause as the coffin entered St. Peter's Basilica, where the late pontiff will lie in state for 3 days before his funeral on Saturday morning. The Vatican says it may keep St. Peter's open beyond midnight tonight to accommodate the large number of visitors hoping to say farewell to the Pope. Coming up, the second highest ranking Senate Democrat announces his retirement, setting the stage for a major debate about the future of the Democratic Party's leadership. Our panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Ending a few weeks of speculation, longtime Illinois Senator Dick Durbin announced today that he will not be seeking re-election at the end of his term in 2026. Listen to what he had to say.
The decision of whether to run for re-election has not been easy. I truly love the job of being United States Senator, but in my heart, I know it's time to pass the torch.
Durbin is the second most senior Senate Democrat. He's tied for fifth most senior senator, having been elected almost 30 years ago in 1996. His departure next year will open up space for new leadership among Democrats and on the Judiciary Committee. It's also expected to launch a very competitive Democratic primary to fill his seat. Joining me now on set is my NBC News Capitol Hill colleague, Sahil Kapoor, Megan Hayes, a former special assistant to President Biden, and Brendan Buck, the former advisor to Republican House Speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan. He's also an NBC News political analyst. So, Sahil, I wouldn't say that this came as much of a shock to those of us that cover Capitol Hill. We've been expecting Senator Durbin to step aside, especially because I think he only raised like $40,000, which is probably the biggest tell. But I think this really does set off a pretty big scramble for who could potentially replace him.
Yeah, I'd put this in the category of well-anticipated, but still a really big deal on three different fronts. The first is, and most immediately, it opens up a safe blue seat in Illinois in the Senate, which doesn't happen very often. There's already been jockeying behind the scenes, from some candidates who are looking at it. The names that have risen to the top, who are very much in the mix right now, are three members of the House, Lauren Underwood, Raja Krishnamurthy, who, by the way, has $19 million in the bank.
Different than 40,000, yes.
He's not going to need that for a safe blue House seat, so clearly he's looking at something bigger. And then there's Robin Kelly, of course, the Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Also watch what Governor J.B. Pritzker wants. He tends to get his way from time to time in Illinois. That's going to be an interesting primary. In the Senate, the Judiciary Committee, they're going to need a new ranking member. That one's probably going to be Sheldon Whitehouse because Democrats in the Senate live and die by seniority. He's next in line. I'd be surprised if anybody else gets it. And finally, the whip job. This is a really interesting moment for the Democratic Party. It's changing. Who's going to take advantage of that moment and rise to the top? Is it going to be someone younger like Brian Schatz? Is someone like Amy Klobuchar going to take a run at it? Patty Murray could be a dark horse if she wants it. Not clear to me that she does.
And there's also the possibility that maybe this is towards the end of Chuck Schumer's tenure, and whoever fills into that slot could be next in line to become the next majority leader. So there's a lot on the line here. So, Megan, I don't know if we're quite ready to call it a trend here, but Durbin, now the fourth Senate Democrat we've seen that's opting out of a re-election bid. We've usually seen some of these guys hang on into their late 70s and sometimes even 80s. Do you think this is a coincidence, or could this be fallout from what we saw happen with the Biden campaign in 2024?
I think it's absolutely fallout what we saw from the Biden campaign. I also think that these Democrats are reading the tea leaves here. that the Democratic Party wants to move to a much younger generation of leaders and wants to shift their focus forward. And in his statement today, he said he was going to be 88 at the end of another term if he ran again. That's an extraordinary. You're making decisions for generations to come that really are. You have no understanding of what's happening. And so I do think it's the right decision for some of these members to start to retire and move to a younger generation.
I think it's also recognition that Senate Democrats have a very uphill climb to take back the majority, and they're probably going to be in the minority for a while. And the Senate is not a great place to be in general these days. You talk to any senator, it's not the job that they thought it was going to be. And so why stick around when it's not a lot of fun and you're not going to actually be able to legislate?
Right. And so Durbin, Brendan, as we look back on his career, he does hail from an era in the Senate where they did make deals, right? Where Republicans and Democrats came together and try and get stuff done. He was a member of the Gang of Eight. They tried to come to a grand bargain with one of your old bosses on immigration. You kind of already alluded to this, but is that era of Congress in the rearview mirror? Are we not going to have these kind of deal makers like we once had?
Certainly not as frequently as we had. Now, we have seen those things recently. There was the bipartisan infrastructure law. There was some gun legislation that happened. So it still happens sometimes. But that spirit of cooperation has gone away in large part because it's not rewarded. Nobody can go home and talk about the bipartisan deal they cut. They want to know, what did you do for conservatives or for progressives? So people like that who are used to getting those deals done, it's what's the point? Because whenever you try, you're going to get your head taken off, and that's what we've seen time and time again.
So, Sal, on the other end of this, we've seen Democrats kind of recognize that the voters are asking for a generational shift. We're not necessarily seeing that on the Republican side. You've seen people like Chuck Grassley decide to run for re-election despite his age. President Trump, of course, turning 79 in June. Are we shifting the kind of arguments about who is the older party now when you had President Biden as a standard bearer for Democrats before?
Well, firstly, Chuck Grassley is going to be 95 at the end of his current term. That man is a freak of nature. I almost put him in a different category. But yeah, I think the Republicans have just decided they want Donald Trump to be their leader right now. It's not a generational question for them so much as it is for Democrats. For Democrats, it's partly generational. It's not ideological so much as it was in 2016. The Bernie versus Hillary moment, that's past. The contrast that I see is active versus passive. They want leaders who are less the old school Dick Durbin style of politics and more who know how to use modern media, who know how to leverage their platforms to rally voters, especially in the second Trump era. It's not just liberals anymore. It's moderate Democrats who are enraged by what they're seeing. And they want fewer Dick Durbins, frankly, in the Senate. They want more AOCs, more Brian Schatzes, not necessarily ideological, but people who know how to make some noise.
Yeah, I want to change gears a little bit. President Biden, a popular topic of President Trump's on the campaign trail. It's continued in the Oval Office, despite the fact that I don't think President Biden's ever going to run for anything again. Take a listen to the president over the past couple of days.
We were losing $5 billion a day during the Biden administration. You remember when the bunny took Joe Biden out? He's not taking Trump out. This was Biden's war, by the way. By me getting involved, they'll say, oh, Trump. This is not Trump's war. I rebuilt our armed forces in my first term, got them almost entirely rebuilt. Then we had a catastrophe known as Biden.
I want you guys to listen to this. Our colleagues crunched the numbers. They found that Donald Trump has spoken about Biden or his family or his administration at least 580 times, either in public remarks or on social media since he took office. Megan, that's 6 times a day. What's the goal here from Donald Trump?
I find this really entertaining. Joe Biden is definitely living rent-free in Donald Trump's head. You don't see Joe Biden being in Delaware thinking about Donald Trump. So I think it's really interesting. I just think it's, Donald Trump is upset that Joe Biden was the only person that beat him and he couldn't have a rematch because Joe Biden stepped out. So we're just going to hear about this for the next 4 years and blame everything. But the problem is there's polling that's come out that he's underwater on every single issue, including immigration. So he's not listening to the American people. He's too focused on Joe Biden and what Joe Biden allegedly did to him. And it's humorous to me.
Brendan, is it that he needs a foil? He's got to have someone to have grievance with?
I mean, this has not been a successful start to this administration. Let's be clear. I mean, early on, they moved quickly. They got some things done, and it looked like maybe they had sort of figured out how to run a White House early on. But obviously, the economy potentially going into recession and all of the hiccups he's had through the courts, he needs to change the subject. He needs someone to point the finger at, because at this point, and look, let's be clear. If the economy goes into free fall right now, he'll have a hard time blaming anybody else, but he will try. And that's what Donald Trump does. He's always the victim. So I think that's what this is about.
But Sahil, there is polling that's shown that people that voted for Donald Trump don't regret that vote at this point. Is Brendan right? I mean, if the economy continues the direction that it seems to be headed in, will he be able to avoid the blame for that, or will his attacks on Biden, accusing Biden of being responsible for this, could that still resonate with voters?
I don't think it will, for the simple reason that Donald Trump was chosen by swing voters in this election overwhelmingly because they saw him as better on the cost of living. They saw him better on dealing with inflation. They see him as a good steward of the economy. I know some people think that's a crazy idea, but generally voters saw that in 2016. They saw that in 2020. It's why he overperformed. Overwhelmingly, you know, that's the single biggest reason that he won in 2024. Through his first term, even during COVID, he was seen as a good steward of the economy. Now that's going away. He's underwater deep on cost of living and inflation. If that persists, he loses his most important political firewall. Speaking of foils, can I make just one other point? The fact that Elon Musk is still out there, he's a dream foil for Democrats. Democrats would love to see Elon Musk continuing out there on the campaign trail because as far as they see it, he brings all the downsides of MAGA, you know, including the abrasive rhetoric, the far-right ideology, the conspiracy theories, without any of the charm and the humor and the charisma that Donald Trump brings that makes him likable or at least tolerable. So as far as foils go, they're going to keep going after him.
Does any part of that help Trump, though, act as a heat shield? He can blame, at some point, Elon Musk for some of these problems?
To an extent, but it didn't help in Wisconsin.
But at the end of the day, this isn't going to impact Donald Trump. It's going to impact Republicans who are running in the midterms and then whoever runs in 2028. So Donald Trump can kind of do whatever he wants. He's a lame duck president. So whether he blames Joe Biden or blames someone else, this is going to impact 2026 and 28 Republicans, not him.
Although he still keeps talking about running for a third term. I know I bring that up all the time, and people think I'm crazy, but I'm just saying he doesn't say no. All right, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. Sahil, Megan, Brendan, appreciate y'all being here. Still to come, new drama and fallout at the Department of Defense over Secretary Hegseth's leadership and reported misuse of sensitive information. A live report from the Pentagon is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The latest controversy surrounding Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and his decision to share information about imminent military strikes with his wife and brother continues to cause turmoil at the Pentagon as he faces renewed scrutiny over his handling of sensitive military information. Today, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee slamming the defense secretary and his management of the Defense Department.
Apparently, Secretary Hegseth cares more about his own arrogance than he does about fixing problems. And now he's got multiple staff members having been fired, multiple staff members saying that the department is dysfunctional. It seems fairly clear that he is not up to the task of managing the Pentagon.
It comes as we are learning 2 of the former aides that Hegseth fired have now been exonerated for allegedly leaking classified information to the media. Joining me now is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. She's at the Pentagon. So, Courtney, what more do we know about the investigation into the leaks and how these senior officials ended up getting fired?
Yeah, I mean, here officially, the Pentagon is not really giving us any information about this investigation, not even explaining whether it's ongoing or not. And what's particularly head-scratching about this is we had the Secretary of Defense, and we're having senior officials here who are defending the fact that these 3 officials were walked out of the building, escorted out of the building last week amidst this investigation leak. Now, the individuals included Darren Selnick, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary Hegseth, Dan Caldwell, who was a senior advisor to him. They have both now been exonerated, Ryan. And again, the most fascinating and really startling part about all of this is when they were walked out of the building last week and then fired only days later, they were never given any actual evidence of what leaks they were accused of actually being involved in. They had no idea what the stories were, or they had no evidence that was ever presented to them. So we have very little information. At this point, we believe this overall leak investigation continues. But again, it's hard to say. Not only were those 3 escorted out, but Hegseth's chief of staff, the secretary's chief of staff, Joe Casper, was also taken out of his job last week with very little information. It took us days even to get the information that he was no longer in the job.
So if these 2 former aides have been exonerated, does that mean they're getting their jobs back?
That's the question that we've been asking all day, and we can't get an answer to that either.
Yeah. So now he's fired his inner circle. I mean, what support does Pete Hegseth have right now inside the building? Is there confidence in his leadership? Is that starting to erode?
So as far as like his inner circle or the front office, I've never seen, maybe back to when the very beginning when Secretary Mattis came into the job. But other than that, I've never seen a time where the secretary has had so little direct support, sort of that inner circle around him, those very close advisors who he can lean on a day-to-day basis. Right now, it really depends on the person who was his junior military aide and now is basically his acting chief of staff. He's a Marine colonel. And then the chief spokesperson here, Sean Parnell. They are the two who really seem to be the closest to Secretary Hegseth right now.
Okay, Courtney Kube, thank you for that. We appreciate it. And we're going to be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press. But as always, the news continues. Today, it's Tom Costello who's in for Hallie Jackson right now on NBC News Now. Thank you so much for watching.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.